roasting, boasting, and the varieties of Greek invective. So I want to begin my talk today by asking you to recall what your first reaction was when you read this poster for the paper. And probably you smiled and said something like, "That sounds like a lot of fun." And that's certainly what I would have said when I see the title, the phrase roasting and boasting. You didn't explain the mettre sur la grille ou griller? C'est une phrase anglaise. Ça veut dire, oui, c'est pour attaquer. Mais exposer quelqu'un, oui. Mais c'est un genre de moquerie ou un genre très spécifique. Et c'est différent du moquerie de la vie quotidienne. C'est spécial. Okay, so that's what I probably would have said, but one asks oneself, why would this be so? Why is it funny? This is invective we're talking about. And invective, the speech of insult and abuse, and mockery and sarcasm, vituperation, all of these things, name-calling, in real life, anyway, is really not something very nice at all. I should think that none of us likes to be inveighted against or attacked, insulted, and if we ever find ourselves in the position of dishing it out ourselves, of offering mockery to others, we usually do so in a frame of mind that can hardly be pleasant. We're usually angry, we're furious, worked up beyond reason and decorum. The last time I witnessed a scene of true invective between two people is a case of road rage, as they say, or anger between drivers. Out in front of me on a gritty street in Philadelphia, it was a truly horrifying moment, which proceeded quickly from abusive epithets to fist-fighting, really. It was horrible. It seemed to me then a real paradox, then, that invective can be so amusing to hear or to think about. The paradox got me to thinking in broad terms about the very nature of the phenomenon, about what work invective is supposed to do, and how context and occasion determine its contours. Above all, it got me thinking about invective as performance, or more precisely, whether it must always be considered a performance, and if so, what this implies about the triangulated relationship between the verbal aggressor, the target, and the putative, the hypothetical audience. And if we all tend to find the very thought of invective amusing, does this mean that we default to conceptualizing invective as a necessarily comic performance of some sort? And why would we do this when, at least in real life, it's perfectly clear that someone moved to engage in invective is usually not explicitly trying to be funny? These are, of course, huge questions that could be asked of invective in any historical period, but they're particularly relevant to the ways in which it's approached in ancient Greek and Roman culture. For while it's easy to recognize that the contexts for ancient invective were as diverse as they remain today, there's a tendency to regard the phenomenon as a relatively constant or monolithic, even as the situations in which it appears change. Aristophanes, Demosthenes, and Aeschines, for example, are all famous for their invective. But the first, Aristophanes, was creating dramatic characters for the comic stage, and the latter two were writing prose speeches for the law court. They sometimes share a common vocabulary of vituperation, or draw on similar store of abusive tropes, and these similarities have led scholars to treat all these authors as doing more or less the same thing when they attack their targets. But while each of them certainly performs invective, as we might say, the intentions and results are different in each case, and these examples of literary invective raise another question, namely, what relationship their invective bears to the invective of real life? The fish seller in the Agora yelling at the shoplifter, or the man who's cut off on the road by another traveler, thinking of Oedipus and his father, for example. Every one of these people is attacking someone else, but to what effect? To what end? And as one asks of the proverbial tree falling without witnesses in the forest, does it make a difference if there's an audience to hear an invective outburst? So the questions I'm asking here, and you'll see some of my corrections here throughout in your text if you're following along, are rather distinct, but they're best answered in relation to one another, and an argument can only be sustained if we keep all of these questions at play at the same time. In the end, what I have to say today is part protreptic and part substantive. In general, I'd like to make the case that we should consider invective with considerably more nuance than's usually accorded, especially by classical scholars. Too often people assume that of the many forms of human behavior out there and the ways that have evolved to represent them in literature and art, interpersonal aggression is relatively straightforward, if only because it's so in your face, as we would say, so available for all to see. On this view, the comic invective symposiastic roasting of a community of philoi, heroic battle vaunting, there's the word we were talking, vaunting, battle vaunting is the old English word, or even older, more archaic word, flighting is used. We don't use this in our normal speech, but it's often used in literary discussions of this kind of boasting on the battlefield. Athenian political and forensic invective, or the mundane invective of daily life, whether these differ from one another only in the details. Except for their different cast of characters, they are essentially variations of the same activity. As I've hinted a few minutes ago, however, a few scratches beneath the surface, a few questions, for example, about invective as performance, as comedy, or its opposite, and the situation begins to appear far more complicated. We need, I think, more nuanced models than we currently employ for analyzing invective in antiquity, and a clear articulation, insofar as we can, of its taxonomy. Now, this is a lot to take on in one talk, of course, but I'll try at least to make a useful beginning. And here's what I'm going to propose. That any given form of ancient invective must be situated along a spectrum, or perhaps plotted on a grid, you can kind of graph it out on graph paper, according to the ways in which it can be analyzed in terms of the following criteria. Number one, self-consciousness of invective as performance. Number two, conceptualization of an audience, les spectateurs, broadly conceived. That is, who is supposed to be listening to the invective and from what perspective. Three, the credibility or legitimacy of the vituperator's claims to righteousness or justice. Number four, a putative hypothetical relationship to real life. And five, which is related to four, invective as speech act. But that term I just used in the traditional philosophical way or linguistic way, whether it's supposed to do anything. I suspect many of you could add to this list. This is hardly exhaustive, as there's plenty other things I'm sure we could go on with, but these strike me as particularly fundamental to an understanding of what invective is doing in any given instance. The more specific and doubtless controversial point I'd like to argue for today is, simply put, that all invective at some level is a species of comedy if it's intended to be heard by an audience. An actual physical audience is not required, only the assumption that one is composing invective also to be heard by a party other than the target of abuse. Perhaps this is another way of suggesting another set of criteria to evaluate invective, namely between composed and spontaneous invective. A person who bursts forth with spontaneous verbal aggression may well draw on a store of internalized tropes, but the invective remains unmediated by the consciousness of an audience to play to. Everything changes, however, once one has the time to think through how to abuse a target, to compose the attack. One's first audience, in this case, is oneself, choosing the words, imagining the sound, and rehearsing the event, whether or not a real audience ever materializes. And this exercise, this act of composing an invective in advance of its delivery, I would like to suggest, tends to make it an essentially comic enterprise. Just how complicated this notion actually is will become clear in the ancient examples that I would like to focus on today, and then in a few parallels from our own time, which I'll bring in at the end. All the ancient evidence I'll be discussing must necessarily belong to the category of composed invective, since we obviously cannot recover any true examples of spontaneous invective from antiquity without a time machine. So, this means that I regard all the examples I'll be turning to shortly as belonging to the comic in some sense. But our task will be to determine what the nature of this comedy actually is. And to do this, we'll want to have recourse to the 5 criteria that I mentioned earlier. So I want to begin with an example that you've already heard alluded to by Professor Destray. It will seem obvious enough, but no less elusive for all its notoriety. That's the Thersites episode in Homer's Iliad 2. Now you'll remember that Thersites appears early in Iliad 2 after Agamemnon rather oddly decided to test his troops by disingenuously urging them to abandon the cause and leave for home. Only Odysseus manages to restore their resolve and muster the soldiers again for battle. But from the ranks, Thersites emerges to attack Agamemnon for softness and venality, in a speech of fierce mockery and invective. Odysseus responds not only with his own counter-invective, but with physical blows that successfully humiliate Thersites and curb any further dissent from him. This passage is enormously rich and has been analyzed in a variety of ways. There are particular complexities concerning its narratological framework because Homer offers several competing perspectives on Thersites. There's Odysseus' perspective, Thersites' perspective, and the narrator's perspective, not to mention a sort of competition among audiences, the internal audiences of Greek soldiers who witness the events in the narrative, whatever audiences the poet Homer imagined himself to be composing for, and last but not least, ourselves as audience. Gregory Nage has famously argued that Thersites should be analogized to a blame poet, as he calls it, though Thersites obviously is not composing poetry of any sort in his imagined life as a soldier at Troy. Satirist, the term satirist is perhaps a more appropriate term than blame poet, but the question itself of whether this is how Thersites is actually characterized in this passage is still a very tricky one. So I've argued elsewhere, and this is largely in that book, for example, that insofar as true satirists blame from a stance of self-righteousness, from Homer's perspective, Thersites is more of the target of blame than the self-righteous blamer himself. A role assumed, again from Homer's point of view, more by Odysseus. Leaving aside such narratological problems for the moment, however, we can certainly say that Thersites himself, from his perspective, would regard himself as a satirist and employs typically satirical tropes. Vituperative indignation at the hypocrisy of those in power, an attempt, which fails here, as Homer tells it, to enlist the sympathies of his audience as an in-group, and so on. Like most satirists, moreover, Thersites has an air of abjection about him. At 2:12 and 5-15, he's described, and some of these you can follow on the handout, passage number 1. I won't read everything in there for the sake of time, but you can follow along. He's described as a blathering fool and a rabble-rouser. This man had a repertory of choice insults he used at random to revile the nobles, saying anything he thought the soldiers would laugh at. Thersites at least thought of himself as a comedian in some level, and the blurred lines between performance and lived reality, so typical of satirists across the ages, holds here as well. One can get dizzy thinking through all the nuances of the invective passages on display here. Homer makes it clear, as we've seen, that Thersites is a comic performer, says anything to make people laugh. His invective is typically designed to get a laugh from a group of listeners, and under normal circumstances, his invective would constitute a form of generically sanctioned comic speech, displaying a high degree of self-consciousness about performativity, about his audience, and hence a strong awareness of invective as a composed type of speech marked off from the discourse of the real world. But Homer begrudges all this to Thersites, as if he wants to highlight the fine line between the innocuous, mediated invective of comedy and invective as speech act, that is, as something that has real effects on the real world. And that Thersites has crossed it. Homer, in other words, offers us a representation, a mimesis, of the invective of a comedian, but presents it as decidedly uncomic and worthy of punishment. Why, though, would Homer be so worried about the vituperation of a man known to be a blathering fool? No doubt precisely because he understood that invective, especially composed invective, as Thersites' certainly was, implies an audience and a desire to make them laugh. And this laughter is in turn designed to forge a bond with them over against the target. Who knows whether we are supposed to imagine any of the Greek soldiers laughing along with Thersites, as opposed to at him, as he was abusing Agamemnon. But Homer, the narrator, doesn't tell us, and he was not about to endorse that sort of comedy anyway, since from his perspective, Thersites' cause was inherently unjust. We have here then a case in which two kinds of invective are distinguished from each other by the different claims to justice that their narrator invests with them, and the different responses they elicit from those who listen to them. Both Thersites and Odysseus, that is, engaged in invective, but Homer makes Thersites unjust and his comic railing a failure, while his Odysseus, with his counter-invective, captures the moral high ground. Odysseus, moreover, while hardly portrayed as a comic figure here, succeeds with his invective and the physical violence that follows it, at least in part because his audience of Greek soldiers saw the justice of his cause and the comedy of its performance. At 267 to 77, Homer describes the aftermath. Thersites sits down, bloodied from Odysseus' blows and stifling his tears, and the soldiers, though grieving in their hearts, laughed pleasurably at him. This is number 2. Both displays of invective can be situated, therefore, along the spectrum I mentioned earlier. Each is a deliberate performance with comic pretensions, however understated, and their success, if we put it this way, measured as a function of how well they enlist the sympathies of an audience, rises or falls according to the amount of justice the audience is allowed to see in them. Now, if invective performance is, as I want to argue here, always fundamentally about comedy at some level, the Thersites episodes demonstrates clearly that this is a comedy essentially deployed as a means of exercising one person's power over another. Freud certainly recognized this in his famous treatise on jokes and the unconscious. Some of you may know this. It's one of the more enduring works of Freud. I know I'm in Francophone countries, I'm in a good space to talk about Freud. It's harder to get away with it in America and England. But the work on jokes and the unconscious actually does seem to have endured a little better, worn better than some of the other works. So he recognized this in his famous treatise on jokes and the unconscious, where he argued that tendentious joking, that is, jokes that serve a purpose, in contrast to what he calls innocent jokes, that merely give the listener a sort of benign, unfocused pleasure, that tendentious jokes should generally be viewed as the production of an aggressor against a second person construed as an enemy, and for the pleasure of a third party, an audience, who, Freud puts it, has been bribed by the effortless satisfaction of his own libido. For Freud, as we might expect, hostile joking arose from the repression of innate aggressive impulses, which in some hypothetical pre-civilized era would have invariably ended up in physical assault. With civilization, as he puts it, however, humans have developed oblique symbolic systems of acting out this aggression. Verbal attack, for example, replaces actual physical attack. So the passage, in the interest of time, I won't read this passage, but have a, wait, oh, did I put this on? Yeah, there it is. Okay, so you can read this number 3, and I'll just continue on without reading it. But have a look at it while I'm talking, because it's a great passage. Despite what may now seem in this passage a little bit kind of reductive anthropology, his fundamental insight that invective is really about power seems sound enough. Freud, however, is really interested in the dynamics of hostile joking and invective in real life, in actual interpersonal relationships. It's curious, though, that unless we happen to be exceptionally hot-headed people or live with people who are, most of the invective we encounter in our lives is probably going to be mimetic, that is, representations of invective, mediated by genre, form, occasion, and so forth, not real lived experiences. This fact, I think, significantly complicates Freud's straightforward analysis of invective, since it introduces a fourth agent, namely the person doing the representing. We've essentially seen this already in the case of Thersites, where we have Thersites attacking Agamemnon, Odysseus counterattacking Thersites, both performing for the Greek soldiers. Here's your triangulation. It's already a little more complicated than Freud's simplex model, which makes no provision for counter-invective. And then there's Homer, the narrator, performing for us, that is, representing these displays of invective for his own audiences, but without himself actually being the aggressor. What does this all amount to, you may well ask? Well, it means, I think, that we cannot rely on any single calculus for understanding Greek invective once it comes down to us, as it necessarily must, as a phenomenon mimetically represented in literary form. That fourth agent, as I just called it, is always there, orchestrating after the fact, the author, recounting the moment of invective as performance with his own tendentious, now aestheticized agenda. In the remainder of the talk, I want to explore it with a few revealing cases. If we have time, we have to cut one of them, we'll see. How an awareness of such literary dynamics affects the practical interpretation of Greek invective. So how can anyone talk about Greek invective without discussing Aristophanes, of course? He may be an obvious starting point, but what a headache for scholars he's turned out to be when it comes to dealing with his invective. For here we see the classic problem. Dramatic characters will routinely attack one another verbally, hoping, in Freudian terms, to please an audience internal to the plot, often a chorus, for example. But of course, Aristophanes is the grand orchestrator. He's that fourth agent I was talking about. And he's out to please his own audience of Athenians, and presumably posterity, us today. Do we take the poet at his word? Do we assume he doesn't like the people he sets up for ridicule in the plays? What about representation of agones, the contests? Representations of these contests, where two sides each confront each other with abuse. How do we evaluate the assertions of power here that each side is seeking? What if, for example, we forget to take sides with anyone because we are too busy laughing at the invective? Let's look briefly at one typical example from Knights, where the sausage seller is first introduced to confront the Paphlagonian or the Cleon figure. So I actually will not read this, but once again, it's a long passage. You don't need to read it terribly carefully to get the idea of what's going on here. So you can have a look at the Greek, on page number 4, and then the English from Alan Summerstein's translation, but you see what's going on here. So how difficult can it be to understand this passage, one might ask? After all, it's obvious that the play is against the Paphlagonian. He's the villain, and Aristophanes must be urging an obvious anti-Cleon political stance. In terms of our spectrum of criteria for analyzing invective, we have plenty of comedy here from both antagonists. Hyperbolic language, puerile, obscene diction, the usual stuff you find in Aristophanic psalgos. But in the heat of the moment, where does the justice lie? Whose side are we supposed to take? If the sausage seller is really supposed to be better than the Paphlagonian, why is it constantly emphasized that he is a greater poneros than his counterpart? When the chorus says, as a final comment on this invective exchange, that there really are things hotter than fire and speeches more shameless than the shameless speeches that are uttered in the city, whose speech are they actually referring to? Sommerstein says it refers to the sausage seller, which in fact is hardly clear. But if it's true, makes it even more difficult to pinpoint a moral center, which we always seem craving to do in cases of one person attacking another. Who's right? Whose side should we be on? There is indeed a display of power here, but the power of the two antagonists is almost beside the point. Their invective against each other, at any rate, pretty much cancels each other out. Rather, it's Aristophanes making fun of each character by means of the other's invective who succeeds, as Freud would say, in enlisting our sympathies and bribing us with the pleasure of a laughter that comes from witnessing victory over an enemy. As the fourth agent, Aristophanes, he doesn't even have to take sides. All he needs to do is show us the invective and make it really funny. The enemy here, then, is rather indistinct, and Aristophanes' motives perhaps less political than we might rush to assume. Laughter may not entirely trump politics. I don't want to say that politics is completely irrelevant, but it surely diverts his audience. Laughter diverts his audience from the actual issues of right and wrong, from the details that led to the invective, enough to invite them to join the poet, if only momentarily, in an apolitical assertion of communal superiority. As Aristophanes might say, it's you and I against those idiots. We, at least, are above the fray. We're above this all. My audience, Aristophanes, my audience, and those people over there. And because the two antagonists are such caricatures of the types they represent, the work of Aristophanes' representations of their invective ends up little more serious than that of a modern, here we have the term roast, in this kind of ritual of abuse, this kind of where everyone understands what's supposed to happen, and it's okay to make fun of somebody in that context. Where the expectation, even the desire for invective on the part of the aggressor, the target, and the audience alike, serves to detoxify and trivialize the power relationships that would normally apply in the real world. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so far my examples have come from Greek poetry, where poetic form and generic protocols have at least some mediating effect on our understanding of invective passages. What's more, poets, even when they claim to be speaking in their own voice, are essentially fictionalizing, and their work belongs, at the end of the day, to the realm of entertainment, however broadly we may choose to define that term. But what about prose literature, which purports to document events of the real world and represent the real feelings of real people? Greek oratory is one obvious example of this sort of writing, and it's worth considering how forensic invective differs from the poetic invective we've been considering. So I'm going to skip a little bit of my text and go to the next page in the interest of time, to page 12 if you're following along. But and pick up in just a little, if you look at the passage from Demosthenes, number 5, on the handout, this is the passage I'm talking about, a kind of a good example of oratorical and rhetorical invective from Demosthenes. So this kind of invective, in fact, does very different work from the poetic varieties we've discussed. This is the top of page 12. There is boasting here. We were discussing in the car whether you have this term, se vanter, something like that, but that's not quite the same. But we would say there's boasting here, but no roasting. So, in other words, this is no roasting. It's not a ritual where everyone's happy to hear the abuse. Okay, this invective is intended first and foremost to be a speech act with a consequence for the real world. Something we cannot say about Homer's Thersites, and only with great qualification about Aristophanic invective. I mean, so in the case of Thersites, Homer's Thersites has an imagined effect on his world, but not on the world of us, not on our world, in our lived life. All three examples of invective, in short, end up doing slightly different things, depending on how and in what measure the various constituent elements interact with each other in the hands of the given author. To put this another way, if we told Demosthenes that his invective against Aeschines was hilarious, but ended up turning our sympathies towards him, towards Aeschines, rather than against him, Demosthenes would surely regard that passage as a failure. If we told Aristophanes that although we recognized that the Paphlagonian is the real villain of the play, half the time the invective passages were so brilliant, we had no idea what to think about the issues or personalities in any given moment. If we told him that, Aristophanes probably would not be terribly disturbed. We also find examples of Greek prose invective somewhere in the middle of our spectrum, between the generically marked world of comic fiction and the rough and tumble world of real politics and law courts. So I want to conclude, and we'll see if I won't read all of this too, but I want to conclude with one such example, where we fast forward 5 centuries to the prolific medical writer Galen, a Greek speaker from Pergamum, active in the 2nd century CE, who spent much of his career working in Rome. This may change in the next 20 years. There's a lot of interest in Galen now, but at the moment he may not be a classical canonical author. But if you want some very rich and creative invective, you should only turn to Galen. There's plenty there that reads better than Aristophanes sometimes. Galen's invective rhetoric, and of course this is a medical writer, right? So you wouldn't expect this to be coming out of him. Galen's invective rhetoric can be certainly strident, but it's also clear that his self-avowed role as a kind of public censor derives as much from an amalgamation of rhetorical postures familiar to him from any number of ancient literary and philosophical works. Genres, as it does from I've got pages mixed up, from an inherently intemperate character, as some people have thought he's just kind of got a personality that's nasty. On the handout, you'll see a typical example of this invective taken from a work called Thrasybulus. It's ostensibly about whether healthiness properly belongs to the medical or gymnastic arts, although by the end of the work, its orientation seems to shift somewhat to the question of what constitutes good and bad gymnastics. So, taking his cue from Plato and Hippocrates, Galen's notion of good gymnastics is not too far from the concerns of dietary regimen and physical exercise. What he objects to, however, is the confusion of gymnastics with athletic training, and the work ends with a scathing rant against athletes and the pretenses of their misguided trainers. For Galen, the athletic state is simply unnatural and encourages a kind of excess that's not only medically but also morally unsound. Okay, so here I'm going to skip most of this, but just go to the last sentence. If you follow on the handout, last one on the handout, number 6, right at the bottom of page 13. It's an almost universally approved proverb because it happens to be perfectly true that a fat stomach does not make a fine mind. The only possibility that remains is that the dust may have presented them with their great wisdom. It would, however, be a little difficult to imagine mud as the progenitor of wisdom, when one observes that it is the habitual abode of hogs, okay, cochon. Nor would one normally consider the lavatories in which they pass so much of their time, these are athletes, a fertile breeding ground for mental brilliance. And yet these are their only activities. It has been plainly observed that they spend their entire lives in a perpetual round of eating, drinking, sleeping, excreting, or rolling in dust and in mud. Okay, so clearly Galen has more on his mind here than the mere medical consequences of bodybuilding. I'm just debating whether I want to make sure we don't run out of time. This is funny stuff, and it's difficult to imagine Galen writing it without smiling himself. Food, consumed in all its varieties and excesses, had a kind of carnivalesque charm to it in old comedy, which Galen no doubt appreciated, and he may well have looked more directly to the Roman satirists who deployed it on occasion as a litmus test of moral rectitude. Too much eating means that you can't control your passions, mean you're morally bankrupt. What interests me here, however, is how we might classify this invective according to the criteria we've been talking about. This is as much literary invective as anything we've seen, but it's more closely aligned to Demosthenes than to Aristophanes, insofar as it purports to have a specific and serious purpose. But as a speech act, the invective seems more diffuse. The work it will do is not as specific as forensic invective, where names are named and the speaker can point to a set of actual consequences. Even when Galen attacks specific adversaries by name, as he often does, the consequences are usually hypothetical, unspecific, philosophical even, more generalized. He may imagine there's plenty at stake, but in reality it's nothing like what's at stake in the case of forensic invective, where lives really can be changed or policy altered as a result. We have seen, I'm skipping a little bit, we have seen then a variety of ways in which Greek authors deployed invective, and we've experimented with several methods of accounting for these idiosyncrasies. The passages we've examined today lead us to conclude, I think, that invective is always funny for some audience in any case. And the way I'd refine this point is to say that the audience who regards invective as a species of comedy will be the audience that construes itself as the intended listener of the performance. This won't mean that a person engaging in invective will always know who his or her audience will be, but only that the invective itself has been crafted by someone, for someone to hear besides the target. An author may even represent two people engaged in mutual invective without an audience in sight, but as soon as that author represents such an episode within a text, an audience, that is we, the readers, come into being. We come into being. We are positioned to contemplate the invective moment as performance. The dynamics here can be extremely subtle, for aggression can be an uncomfortable thing to witness, especially when we find ourselves, as sometimes does happen, without enough cues. This is important to tell. What's the word for cue in French, Pierre? Cues? Clé. Without enough clé, right? To tell how we're supposed to respond. This is a key term. So this is less likely to happen in the case of ancient literary invective, because these texts come down to us mediated by a guiding hand of the author, but I thought a few problematic examples from our own time will serve to highlight the utility of the criteria. I want us first to look briefly, now will come a filmed example of invective that apparently, so this is invective that apparently arises spontaneously, even though it's within a controlled context. This was a famously defining moment, catastrophic, in fact, as it turned out in the history of the 70s punk band, the Sex Pistols. Some of you may, of a younger generation, may know the Sex Pistols. Their appearance on a famous show in 1976, the Bill Grundy Show, which I'll see if I can call up here.
They are punk rockers. The new craze, they tell me. They're heroes, not the nice, clean Rolling Stones. You see, they're as drunk as I am. They are clean by comparison. They're a group called the Sex Pistols. I am told that group have received £40,000 from a record company. Doesn't that seem to be slightly opposed to their anti-materialistic view of life?
More the merrier.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Well, tell me more about it.
Fucking spent it, haven't we?
I don't know, have you?
Yeah, it's all gone.
No one even heard that one because he was drunk himself and he wasn't paying attention. When he asked, well, what did you do to the money? And I said, we fucking spent it.
Well, tell me more about
We
it.
fucking spent it, haven't we?
I don't know, have you?
Yeah, it's all gone.
Really?
Down the booger.
40, really? Good Lord. Now, I want to know one thing. Beethoven, Mozart, Bach and Brahms have all died. Really? What are we saying, sir?
Wonderful people.
Are they?
Oh yes, they really turn us on.
What do they do?
Well, suppose they turn other people on.
That's just their touch, really.
And Rotten, he slipped up and said shit under his breath.
Which one?
Nothing, a rude word. Next question.
No. What was the rude word?
Shit.
Was it really? Good heavens, you frightened me to
Oh,
death.
all right.
What about you girls behind?
I'm like your dad, isn't he, this geezer?
Are you,
Or your granddad.
are you worried or are you just enjoying yourself?
Enjoying myself.
Are you?
Yeah.
That's what I thought you were doing.
I always wanted to meet you.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Susie, she was just being like coy with him. And he said, oh, maybe we'll meet after.
We'll meet afterwards, shall we?
You dirty son. You dirty old man.
Steve completely understood that he was talking to a drunk, as you would a drunk in a pub, and he just topped him.
Well, keep going, Chief, keep going. Go on, you've got another 5 seconds. Say something
You
outrageous.
dirty bastard.
I just remember this fucking cunt just started provoking us and we coated him off.
Go on, again.
You dirty fucker.
What a clever boy.
What a fucking rotter.
Well, that's it for tonight. The other rocker, Abel, and I'm saying nothing else about him, will be back tomorrow. I'll be seeing you soon. I hope I'm not seeing you again. From me, though, good night.
McLaren was there. He was terrified. He was shitting himself.
So what's happening here? They're on a television show. They're being interviewed by this guy here. Now, it turns out that this guy's name is Bill Grundy. He's drunk on the air. He's drunk. And he's provoking them a little. And they're already, it's 1976, and they're the hot new thing that nobody quite understands. They're very countercultural, very transgressive. And the Johnny Rotten, who's over here, and this guy, Steve, I think his name is, they start saying some bad words, like they'll say that and he's drunk and flirting with the woman up there in white. And this clip actually has commentary by Johnny Rotten himself. It's for a documentary film. And so he hears Johnny Rotten saying the word shit, merde, which in English is a little stronger than merde in French. And he says, what was that? What was that? What did you say? What did you say? And he says, shit. And he said, oh. So you're full of nasty words, aren't you? Let's hear you say some more nasty words. And so this guy here, I forget his name, he starts insulting him with obscenities. He calls them, I don't know, can I use, I guess in English it doesn't matter, you fucking cunt, which is very, very bad in English. I'm not sure an analog in French, thank God. I'll get in trouble. But so then, and in the meantime, he says, oh, we should meet. Before that, he says, he's flirting with her and says, we should meet afterwards. And you can see her eyes just kind of, well, let's see if you can. He's asking him if he likes. Beethoven and Mozart, they really turn us on. A rude word, he says. No. What was the rude word? So now he's flirting with her. She says, I always wanted to meet you. He says, oh, well, we'll meet afterwards. And then, so then the guy says, you dirty old man, says, this is what I mean, this is happening. It's just happening. It's unscripted. Say something outrageous. He says, "You dirty fucker, you fucking cunt, you fucking right," all of this. And then, this is live television, live, in the set. So it was a huge scandal, and he was fired the next day, never to be heard of again. Yeah. It was, but there's a moment, it's too bad you can't hear the sound because there's a tone, there's a feeling that you get when you're watching this, which is, uh-oh, something's going to happen here. And they could just get up and start fighting with each other. And it's extremely uncomfortable, even though it's a television show. Clearly there's a performance going on, but that part of the performance was not scripted. And it just goes to show you that you're a little unclear as an audience viewer how you're supposed to respond to this, I think. It's interesting. So let me see. I will skip. That was all the commentary we need on that one. So next I want to, this one, I hope we can see some. The next thing I want to show you is sort of the opposite of this, which is, I wouldn't call this roasting, but it's a ritualized mutual abuse and invective. And this comes from, some of you may know, am I too close to your camera? Some of you may know the movie 8 Mile with Eminem. Yes? Okay, so it's not from the movie itself, but it's from the extras at the end of the DVD. So what's happening here is, this is the director's cut, these extra scenes. And what they filmed is there was a cast of about 300 people. If you've seen the movie, you'll remember there's a lot of locals in some of these concert scenes, at these competitions, concours. And the actors were getting a little bit bored. And there was cold, and they were in a big warehouse. So they decided they would set up a competition, a real competition, not for the part of the plot, but a battle among themselves as a contest. And then they would have a little panel of judges, and the winner would be able to have a rap battle with Eminem. And it's very ritualized, so you may know this, that in this context you have like 15 seconds with a beat, and then you have to improvise. So it's a little bit like Homer, but more obscene. And the point is, you have 15 seconds, you have a beat, and everyone is judging you on the quality of your insult. The quality, well, it doesn't have to be insult, but the quality of your performance, really, because these are antagonistic, they are actually invective performances. So the winner and the finalist was a woman, actually, and whose name goes by the name of Confusion. And so you can see, we'll be really quiet, maybe you can hear a little bit. They're making fun of each other. There you are. What are you going to make fun of? Well, she's short, she's a woman, she's small-breasted, so the insults go right to this. And for him, it's like he's white, she's black, he's white, so there's this kind of interracial kind of banter that goes on. But the point is that this is all in a realm where all of these things are expected, and you're safe, really. You can say pretty much anything, and the more outrageous it is, the more the audience will like it, and the more you're likely to succeed. So let's just see if we can hear any of it.
Confusion, everybody. Whoa, pleasant surprise. Now we gotta do a coin toss. What you wanna be? Heads or tails? Heads. All right, what you wanna do? Ladies first. Okay, ladies first. Ladies first.
Yeah.
DJ, kick that shit.
Yeah. Being rabbits? This silly rabbit don't like leathers. I heard he like dicks. Faggot niggas with ponytails and lipstick. I'm for real. Don't give a fuck. What? It's like this. East side is where I'm from. You got beef, hit me on the street with a badge and a gun. Fuck a badge, I'm coming through with black mags. About to do this B-rabbit nigga cause he's a fag. Like I said earlier in the clause, I stated that in my... Oh shit.
I love whoa. Well, you know, we can't control that. Hey, who knew? You know, let's keep the show rolling. B-Rabbit, you got 30 seconds. DJ, kick that shit.
Alright, look. I can see that I'm put to the test, battling this chick with no breasts. And why I gotta battle a chick, especially one that's whack with a dick. So you a dope MC, don't get mad, start taking your period out on me, cause I ain't done shit to you. What's your name, Diffusion? Well then I guess I gotta diffuse you. This ain't something I'm used to. Why the fuck the future even introduce you? I really don't understand why this chick is up here right now and wants to be a man. On this mic it's rat-a-tat-tat. Why the fuck am I standing here battling the brat? You don't really even want to see this. On this microphone I will eat your fucking fetus. Yo.
All right. We know the B-Rabbit goes to the next round. Victorious and glorious. And love.
So that's it. And so I don't know if you caught that, but he says, I don't understand why why this chick is up here who wants to be a man. So he's making fun of the fact that she's small, she doesn't look feminine, you know, she looks like a boy. Now look, this is the part I wanted you to see. Did you see that? At the end, that no matter what they've said to each other, they embrace in a kind of moment of philia, right? And I mean, it's completely ritualized, and what the content really has very, I mean, it's almost irrelevant, and people are judging on. You heard by the applause in the audience. The more. Okay, so should we stop now?